my greatest pleasure to welcome you all to Ubud Writers and Readers Festival 2023. I'm Hapsarina Choi, your host. Before we start, there are a few things I would like to remind you. Please put your mobile phone to silent. Use no flash while taking photos or videos. And respect each other's space, although I'm very sure it's pretty packed in here right now. Follow us on social media at Ubud Writers Fest and use the hashtag UWRF23 so we all can enjoy your posts. Sorry, Bu Debra. Our session today will be Clashes and Hope, Unpacking the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, featuring Michael Vatikiotis, Antony Loewenstein, and moderated by Kirsti Melville. I would like to remind you that there will be book signing also after the discussion at the upper floor of Antony's book. So ladies and gentlemen, please warmest welcome to our speakers and moderator.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Kirsti Melville. I present the History Lesson on ABC Radio National back in Australia. And it is my absolute pleasure to be here for this session, although I have to say when I agreed to host this session a few months ago, I didn't anticipate how timely it would be.
What a boring old issue.
So I'd like to introduce more fully our guest today, Michael Vatikiotis, who apart from being a festival stalwart, I think he's missed about 3 in the last 20 years. He's a writer and a private diplomat who's lived in Asia for more than 30 years. He's worked as a BBC correspondent and as editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, and he now works on resolving conflicts in Asia and Africa. His latest book is wonderful. I would have liked to have talked more about all of the personal history in this, but I'll have to leave it up to you to go and buy it and read it. Lives Between the Lines, A Journey in Search of the Lost Levant. It's wonderful. And it, as I mentioned, it explores the origins of his family in the Middle East, but more pertinently to this conversation in Palestine. Antony Loewenstein is an independent investigative journalist. You've probably seen him splashed all over the media and Twitter, X, this week. He's a best-selling author and filmmaker who's been reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades. His works appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Al Jazeera English, and the New York Review of Books. He's lived in East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020, and his latest book, The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World, is also extraordinary, and I highly recommend you go and buy that and read it. It's just been longlisted for the Walkley Book Award. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, before we start, I just would like to acknowledge the deep sorrow and loss that people on both sides of this conflict are feeling right now. And I want to let you know that this conversation is coming from a place of empathy and respect, and I urge you all to hear it in that spirit. So on that note, Michael, I'm going to start with you, because when I first heard that you were on this panel, I didn't really know why. And so could you just give the context of what your interest is in this region?
Yeah, because I spent 40 years actually, working in Southeast Asia, a refugee in a way from the Middle East, because I grew up in England. My father was an academic, an Arabist. He was born in Palestine, born in Jerusalem, Palestinian Greek family, and was a refugee himself from Palestine after 1948. Because, we talk about the Palestinians, but non-Jews were not allowed to live there either after 1948. At least those who had government positions, and my grandfather was a railway official. And so he ended up going to the United States and then to the UK. And I grew up with the Middle East conflict, essentially in the living room. He was a fluent Arabic speaker, and so most of it was conducted in Arabic. But I grew up with the sort of context. And I remember vividly in 1981, Anwar Sadat had just been assassinated in Cairo by the Muslim Brotherhood, and I said to my father in the living room, "I'm going to Asia. I'm getting out of here. This is just too horrible." And the other reason is that I had actually wanted to learn Arabic at university. I went to the School of Oriental African Studies, and I'd lived a year in Egypt. And the Arabic department said no, because I wanted to do Arabic part-time, not a full language degree. And they said, you can't possibly learn Arabic part-time. So I ended up doing Thai and Indonesian. So that's why I went to do Asia. But in terms of identity, it was only later in life that I sort of started to realize who I really was, because 40 years in Asia can be quite confusing, especially as a sort of white, Western educated person. Although I was very much aware of my mixed background. And when I came to write this book, I started to sort of figure out, well, exactly who am I? I have a Jewish-Italian mother, Italian-Jewish mother from Egypt, and a Greek Orthodox father with Palestinian blood. And I'm going to just read how I captured it, because I think I nailed it. So I wrote, because on my Singapore ID card it says Caucasian, and I'm offended by that, frankly. I am really a Canaanite, I've decided. A hodgepodge of DNA flung around desert caravanserais, mingled with that of weary Iberian Sephardic outcasts and wild Ottoman janissaries scything their way through the Balkans. I'm a Canaanite.
I'm going to come back a little later to your family history and the Palestine that they found themselves living in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But for now, Antony, I want to throw to you, and I'm interested to hear what you're hearing on the ground right now from friends in both Gaza and Israel.
I want to first thank everyone for coming. This is unbelievably relevant and topical, more I think than many of us even realise when this panel, as Kirsti said, was arranged a few months ago. I'm hearing nothing good, which is not exactly a revelation, but worth saying. I have friends in Gaza who are mostly alive as far as I'm aware. Communication obviously is unbelievably hard. Internet is regularly cut, there's barely any power. A friend of mine just messaged just before I came on here saying that it's often very hard to even get any way to charge your mobile phone, so it's very hard to get accurate information. But having said that, there is a uncontrolled, without constraint Israeli bombardment going on out of anger, revenge, bloodlust, a degree of undeniable fear after the despicable Hamas attack 2 weeks ago, which caused profound, for some Israelis and some Jews around the world, what I would call existential dread. The Hamas attack wasn't about to wipe Israel off the map. I don't mean it like that. I mean that it causes for some Jewish people, and I'm Jewish myself, a sense that this kind of unbelievable ugliness and brutality is what we as collective Jews remember from the dark old days. Now, I would question some of that analogy, but that is the feeling that many Jews have in Israel, around the world. And that anger, and fear, which undeniably happened, has caused Israel, which is currently having the most right-wing fascist government in its history, to unleash a military campaign that many of them in that government have been dying to do for years. This is the moment. This is the moment that many in the Israeli right who are now in charge of that country, not just Netanyahu, but the leadership around him, who have desired for years to find a way to either kick out as many Palestinians as possible from Gaza or kill as many Palestinians as possible from Gaza. I mean, if you think I'm exaggerating that, one only has to hear the rhetoric, not even just in the last 2 weeks. I document some of this in the book, but you can find this very easily online. There is far more mainstream genocidal intent within mainstream Israeli society than most people outside of Israel want to acknowledge. I'm not saying every Israeli Jew thinks like that. Of course they don't. But it's unbelievably mainstream. And to me, one of the key problems with so much of the shock that people feel in the global community now is, and understandable, there's anger and fear and concern, all those emotions are legitimate, is that there has been, in my view, a deliberate whitewashing in much of the Western press about what actually is going on inside Israel, not just the last 2 weeks, for decades. That there has been a, frankly, takeover of the state by what was once a fringe far-right fascist movement the settler movement, is now at the centre of Israeli power. And what that means is it is a exterminationist, genocidal intent. That the vision, if you can call it that, amongst many in the Israeli political mainstream, not just on the right, is we have to finish what we did not finish in 1948. Namely, there was ethnic cleansing in 1948, Israel was established, 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed. Fast forward 75 years, and I have in the book, and there are many other people who have said this just in the last 2 weeks within the Israeli political and media establishment, this is our chance to finish or at least continue that brutal mission. And it's unvarnished, and it's ugly, and it's racist, and it's horrific. So I have Israeli Jewish friends of mine who I've spoken to since the attack. They were not personally impacted, they were not injured, they were not killed. And I'm talking about, for example, Gideon Levy, who's an amazing Israeli writer, journalist. He's my first son, his second name is named after him. He's one of my heroes. He's an amazing man. And he visited some of the areas in the south of Israel where Hamas attacked and killed huge numbers of Israelis. And he said that it was ISIS-like, that the brutality, the ugliness was incredible. Having said that, what he wrote consistently, what he's been saying in the media for the last 2 weeks, and I'll finish on this point, is Israelis, this is his words, Israelis will learn nothing from this attack. Nothing. Now when he means Israelis, he doesn't mean every single one, he means the vast majority of Israelis will not learn anything from this attack. And the comparison he would make is like the US after 9/11. They learnt nothing from that attack, I would argue.
We were discussing this the other day, that, and I'm wondering if Hamas has unwittingly handed Israel that 9/11 moment and I guess some kind of perceived moral high ground to do exactly as you've just described. Michael?
It's a really, I just want to carry on from, I think, Antony's very good framing of the current situation and sort of extend out a little bit to the enabling environment that sort of, I think, helps fuel what this hard right, and I think you're using the right word, fascist, core of the establishment Israel is trying to do. And that is the use of the T word, terrorism. Because if you remember in 9/11, the T word unleashed hell on large numbers of people in the name of revenge for, 3,500 or so American citizens and others who were killed in the Twin Towers. And I think that that's what's happened again. We went from a declaration of war, which I think was the first day or so, or few hours after the 7th of October attack, to it's our 9/11 moment. And that was, I think, quite deliberate on the part of the Israelis, because they know that that unlocks not just sentiment, but also a whole new military configuration on the part of the United States and Europe, plus money. A whole lot of money that can be now spent on supporting Israel in this effort without having to go through appropriations and sort of, the usual channels. And, I was thinking about this, and I think it's very important to frame what we mean by terrorism. And I've actually written this down because I think it's important to be precise. Terrorism is a form of violence that obeys no rules and generates, as we heard, unspeakable atrocity. In the hands of its victims, terrorism gives powerful armies the license to commit acts of terrible revenge that violate the rules of war, resulting in much greater acts of violence, whose victims are denied any redress except to resort to more terrorism. I think that rather sums it up. So the T word is now unleashed, and I think now the rest of the world, in addition to having to deal with that, is now also dealing with a very divided sort of set of public opinions, which is broadly divided into young and old. The younger generation in many foreign ministries around Europe and the United States are, of course, very alarmed by the loss of life and would like to see an immediate ceasefire and talks begin. For whatever reason, the older generation in power is basically saying, no, we have to provide unconditional support. And, there's the money and there's the military configuration and there's all that. And I think the other thing that this contributes to, and I'll end on this, is that this also contributes to this steady decline of our own civilizational approach to the rules-based order, where we no longer are capable of understanding the difference between what is right and wrong, And this is, I think, very serious ramifications for all of us. It started with the Ukraine war, it started with 9/11, but it's now bled into the Russia-Ukraine war, and now, I think, even more manifested in what we're seeing today, where people simply will not accept that international law applies in this situation. And I was quoting earlier King Abdullah as making this, of Jordan, making this very clear. There's one rule for you and one rule for us. And for us, human rights don't apply, international law doesn't apply. You can do whatever you want to us. And I think that's a very, very important civilizational pivot for us. Because if we continue down that road, there will be no rules. There can be no more rules-based order.
What do you think the intent of Hamas was?
Anything I say has to have the caveat that I haven't chatted to the leadership in the last few days, nor have all this information is still being investigated. So that's the caveat to anything that I think anyone can say. But there's a few things I think that can be said fairly confidently. One, from what I'm understanding, a lot of the Hamas leadership didn't expect it to be, in inverted commas, as successful. They expected maybe they would go in there, get some soldiers, take them back into Gaza, and they could negotiate for a number of Palestinians who are in Israeli prisons, often for years, totally illegally. I think there was a sense that they were, Hamas that is, incredibly concerned, as frankly Iran is, that there is a growing so-called normalization deals going on across the Middle East between Israel and Arab countries, which were always built on sand. This, of course, continued during the Trump administration, where some people will remember the US and Israel signed these amazing so-called normalization deals with Bahrain and UAE. Morocco came into it. Saudi was on the cusp. They were all delusional because the vast majority of Arabs in those countries don't support it, A, and B, they were arms deals. And the book talks about this in detail, that most of those Arab states are petrified existentially from another Arab Spring type situation. And the way they're trying to avoid that is to get huge amounts of Israeli repressive technology, spyware, other sort of repressive tech that Israel's tested in Palestine, is sold around the world. And they've bought huge amounts of that. That was part of the negotiation and part of the deal. Now, Trump didn't announce it in that way. It was going to be a new era in the Middle East. It was all bullshit. And Saudi was maybe on the cusp of joining that club. And Hamas and others did not want that because they'd be more isolated. That was also maybe a factor. I think also, finally, I would say that Hamas and other militant groups wanted to send a message to the world in a, frankly, unbelievably brutal way that you cannot lock up Palestinians for decades and make it cost-free. This is what I mentioned before about Gideon Levy, the Israeli writer, who has been saying this fairly uniquely, because most of the Israeli media establishment right now is utter bloodlust. He is saying there is no military solution to this conflict. There never has been, and there will not be now. Zero. And yet, Israel will go into Gaza, ground invasion today, tomorrow, next week, whenever. They will attempt to decapitate Hamas. Maybe, possibly they can do so. Who knows? And then what? I'm very much, let me finish on this, compare it to, again, the 9/11 reference to the US and Afghanistan. The US overthrew the Taliban in 2 weeks. The US overthrew Saddam in 3 weeks. That wasn't the challenge. There was hubris that they were winning the war. It was delusional. Then the guerrilla war started and the US lost both those wars, and in fact hasn't won a war in half a century. Neither has Australia, by the way. We cannot win a war. We actually don't know how to win wars, and because we start wars we shouldn't have started. And I fear that Israel is doing exactly the same thing. They could maybe decapitate Hamas, maybe, possibly, and then what? And just finally, there's a Reuters report 2 days ago that said that there is no Israeli plan. In other words, the Israelis don't know what they're going to do if and when Hamas is overthrown, which leads to inevitable more chaos. And in the eliminationist, exterminationist mindset of much of the Israeli far right, that's actually a good thing. Chaos actually is a good thing. It's what they want.
I think the other tragedy to this, in addition to what, following on from what Antony said, is that I've been in the Middle East 3 or 4 times this year, not in Israel, but in and around in the Levant. And I was actually in northern Iraq just 3 weeks ago. That possibly wearing sort of blinders. I think many people in Syria, Jordan, Iraq, in the Gulf, in Egypt, were starting to sort of enjoy a period of what they call de-escalation. That's not to say that the terrible conflicts that have afflicted those countries in the last 20 years have gone away, but there was a sort of let-up in the pace and even the attention paid to those conflicts. And even I think it was mostly perception. As soon as the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, the Middle East breathed a great sigh of relief. Now, having said that, there were people also saying there's going to be a third intifada. This thing cannot, because of the pressure that the settlers have brought to bear on the West Bank in particular, and I think one big surprise was that it came out of Gaza. I think people expected the anger to boil over on the West Bank, where every day Palestinians are harassed, are killed, are denied basic necessities, their land is taken. Gaza was sort of shut off from Israel, but not the West Bank. And I think people expected the trouble to be there. But at the same time, they were hopeful. I mean, it's partly what you said, which is the Saudis and the Gulfies sort of saying, well, if we can accommodate Israel, we can maybe manage it. I don't think the Saudis were going to sign that thing, by the way. I think they were holding out for an arms deal with the US, and I think they wouldn't have signed. So there was this sort of sense, and the word is confusing to us because they use the term de-escalation. That's not end of conflict. That's just Syria. They want to recover. They want to rebuild their communities. They've had 20 years of more recent war. So I think it's a tragedy in a way, but that's all been blown away. Because now I think, as Antony said, the conflict may well spread to Lebanon, which is a country that is in deep trouble. It may well spill over into the West Bank, and therefore will affect Jordan. I have to say, though, when I was in Erbil in northern Iraq just less than 3 weeks ago, it didn't after the attack, just after the attack, didn't come up once. The Kurds couldn't care less. I mean, they're not Arabs. It's not their fight. They have bigger issues inside Iraq. And I think that you're going to see a lot of that. Egypt, you don't see evidence of mass demonstrations on the streets of Cairo. They're on the streets of Western capitals, but people have got other problems to deal with as well. And I think, to be fair to my sort of Arab friends, this issue was getting it's a terrible thing. And the lack of a solution to the Palestinian problem has always been there. But at the same time, they've got other issues to deal with as well.
Because the Palestinians had been abandoned by basically the entire Arab world, not the Arab people. I'm talking about the Arab elites had abandoned the Palestinians in the deluded belief that somehow the conflict would just kind of go away. And what they're finding, these deeply corrupt, mostly Western-backed thugs that we support and fund and arm, not necessarily the three of us on the stage, probably, can't speak for you two, but don't fund them directly, but we in the West are funding them, supporting them, protecting them, under this illusion of indefinite security. And Michael mentions de-escalation. I'm not saying he's wrong on that, but I would say if you are in Palestine, the violence, Gaza and the West Bank, even before the last 2 weeks, it's been the deadliest period for decades.
But
Palestinian civilians are dying every single day.
But can we also ascribe some blame, please, to the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinians?
Backed and funded by us.
Because, my father, bless him, before he died, he went to school with the founding members of the PFLP, the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And, these were the original sort of hijackers and launched the initial campaign of violence outside of Palestine. And I remember him, in his diaries after he died, I read that, he had tried to convince the Palestinians through the council that they should raise money on the ground and they should focus the struggle on the ground. But no, what did they do? They took money from the sheikhs, from the oil barons, from the corrupt states, and they got rich. And they decided to take that money instead of raising money from the ground for the struggle on the ground. And the PLO, the Palestinian movement, became rather detached from Palestine. This is sort of pre-Oslo, pre the formation of the West Bank and so on. And it was just sad to see these people who were campaigning internationally for their freedom, who, like many, many armchair rebels, were basically being treated by the rich oil sheikhs who never, my father always argued, never intended to fight for them in Israel. After the 1967 war, that's it. They knew that Israel could not be defeated, and they gave up. So you're right. but also ascribe the blame to the Palestinian leadership, please.
I have for 20 years. They are deeply corrupt,
Yeah.
deeply complicit, and mostly backed and funded by us.
Well, where is Mahmoud Abbas in all of this?
Chain smoking, summer in Ramallah, about to die, and it couldn't come a day soon enough. I mean, seriously, these people have no credibility. Not talking about with me. The Palestinians in Palestine regard people like him, for those who don't know, he's the supposed leader of the Palestinian Authority, has no authority. His 4-year term expired more than 12 years ago. He's a typical Arab Western-backed thug that no one respects. And one of the possibilities that I'm hearing is that if and when Hamas is overthrown, we'll just bring the Palestinian Authority back and they'll control Gaza. It's delusional, either by him. How he's still alive at 87 and chain smoking is beyond me, but he is. But it's, the thing that is so often, I think, missed in so much of the Western coverage of this issue is this is a colonial issue. This is imperialism. It's not just a conflict between two sides who can't get along. It's colonialism. That's what it's always been. If you displace people for decades and decades and decades, you can't be surprised if they rebel and resist and get damn angry, even if the whole world mostly chooses to ignore it until they can't anymore.
I think this is a good place to jump back a bit and get some context for how we've ended up where we are today. And Michael, I'm interested to hear if you could paint a picture for us of the Palestine that your great-grandfather, I believe it was your great-grandfather,
He arrived from Greece, yeah.
From Greece to Palestine. What was the Palestine that he arrived in like?
It's a very... After I wrote the book, and I, like many people who look at that 100-year period from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, a sort of halcyon period of relatively sort of peaceful cosmopolitanism, which was essentially built by the Ottomans through their rather neglectful form of imperialism. They let people be, and many of the local leaders of the Ottoman Empire, took sort of skills and people and trade from everywhere. But it's interesting that period is going through a revival in the thinking about what the Middle East of the future should look like. All the lines that were drawn and all the conflicts that were generated by the post-colonial era, if only we could get rid of all that and go back to what we were before, which was squabbling communities, rather unequal. Jews were not equal citizens under the Ottoman Empire, or non-Muslims, but everyone was sort of allowed to live together and get on. So but the Palestine that my great-grandfather and my grandfather was born into was one of relative calm and I would say peaceful coexistence for a number of communities. You had the Palestinian Arabs of the Galilee, sort of the River Jordan Valley and the Sea of Galilee. You had the coastal Arabs who were sort of piratical, sort of merchant, rather influenced by the Ottomans, mixed in with a sprinkling of sort of Balkans and Greeks and Italians, and that's where the cosmopolitan was along the coast. And then you had the Orthodox Jewish communities in the holy sites, and most importantly the Greek Orthodox Church, which controlled everything. I mean, today in the land of Israel, 1/3 of the land of Israel is actually owned by the Greek Orthodox Church. The Knesset, the Prime Minister's residence, is actually built on Greek land. And they were all sort of happily, but not so happily in the end, because as European imperialism started to impact on the region and the Turks, the Ottoman Empire declined and the Europeans started coming in, everyone started to squabble a little bit. And the first thing that happened in the Holy Land was that the Christian missionaries started coming in and displacing, for God's sake, the Greek Orthodox. And so there was an immediate fight between the Orthodox Greeks and the Franciscans and the Catholics over the holy sites. And then the next thing that happened in the 1920s and 30s is Jewish immigration started, just before the Second World War, encouraged by the Brits since the Balfour Declaration. And that started to displace relationships and communal harmony, particularly where my father was growing up in Haifa, which was basically a port city, and it was full of everyone. And it was rather trade unionized, and so it was a bit leftist. And so when the European migrants came, there was an immediate displacement particularly among dock workers and so on. And so there was already tension. But the real turning point came in 1930 with the Arab Revolt. And the Arab Revolt was against the British policy on Palestine. It was very violent. It was put down horribly. Many Jews were killed, many Arabs were killed, but the British basically put it down violently.
Can you just jump back to 1917, to that Balfour Declaration, and tell people what that was and what the promises that were given leading up to that?
Well, I don't have the text in front of me, but it essentially promised a homeland to the Jews. And what's interesting about the Balfour Declaration is the context. Don't forget, this was happening just around the time of the Irish Revolt, which I think was an important part of the context because the Brits were putting down their own people. At the time also, they were exporting a lot of people away from bad places so they could sort of deal with them in different ways. And so the Irish question, I think, was very much in the back of everyone's mind, 1916 onwards. And the empire was reaching its apogee. It was the height of empire. And the British thought that they could just direct things. Well, we can make this decision. They had buyer's remorse almost immediately afterwards. There were several incidents. The Peel Commission was one of them in the 1930s, which basically wanted to reverse that. And they said, no, this is a bad idea because it's causing conflict. Oh my God, what are we going to do? And then the Americans objected seriously to the large-scale immigration in Palestine, seeing it as a casus belli and seeing it as the root of future conflict. And although we all remember that the United States was the first country to vote for partition, they actually tried to fight against it. They were very much against, dividing Palestine, and they knew what was going to come. And so this long tragedy of everyone kind of foretelling the bad things that were going to happen through the sort of history as it was sort of marching along, especially after the Second World, or before and just after the Second World War, it's tragic.
So after partition came into effect, I think May 1948, when the Jewish state was declared, what was the immediate impact?
On Palestinians or
on Palestinians?
Jews? Well, there's sort of a myth that's been told for a long time that the problems in inverted commas only started in 1967. For the first 20 years of Israel's existence, Palestinians were not equal citizens. It's amazing to look back now and see, maybe including some people in this room, who would have regarded years ago Israel as some socialist paradise. It was always bullshit. It was a socialist paradise maybe if you were Jewish, not if you were Arab or Palestinian. You were not an equal citizen in Israel from day one. Never. They weren't sort of having fun making love on kibbutzes. They were living in a deeply unequal way.
How was it though? It was so asymmetrical. There was such a power imbalance.
Can I just add though to Antony, non-Jews as well. My grandfather, Greek Orthodox, had to leave Israel as a government employee, and when he arrived in Greece, a country that he knew from his name but had never been there, he described himself as a refugee.
How is it, you said, how is the disparity of power so clear? I think there was a few reasons. I mean, obviously, we can't separate 3 years after the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel. I mean, Zionism as an ideology only came into existence 50 years before. It's remarkably new, in inverted commas, as an ideology. People obviously had talked about that within Europe, in some form of that the belief that it was not possible to be safe as Jews in Europe. We're always going to be treated as second-class citizens. We have to have our own state somewhere. Now, the founders of Zionism could never have imagined that in less than 50 years they would have their own state. And I think after the Holocaust there was global revulsion. There was still a lot of anti-Semitism in the world, let's be clear about that. There was then and there still is now. But that sense of anti-Semitism was arguably less than anti-Arab sentiment. And there wasn't really a great deal of fear, mistakenly, that somehow establishing a Jewish state essentially on Palestine, there's always been Jews. The Jews had a connection to that area for a long time. Anyone who says otherwise is wrong. However, there were way more Arabs and Palestinians there than there had been Jews. Obviously, over time, that number changed. But I think there was a belief, a deluded belief by the US, by the UK. I mean, the UK's role then was done. Their empire days were gone. And they still sort of live the glory days, but it's over, guys. Hello, they're done. The Americans haven't quite recognised that their days are going to come to an end soon too, but nonetheless, there is this idea, I think, somehow that you can, as Michael said, put people on a chessboard in the hope that it'll somehow work out okay. And I think by 1967, the Six-Day War, Israel taking control of East Jerusalem, Gaza, the West Bank and the Golan Heights, that then Messianic Judaism took off.
Yeah.
And the impact of that 60 years later is exactly where we are now, where there's always been a fringe of far-right fascist Judaism, like in any religion. It's not unique to Judaism. But what has happened, it's been empowered for years in the extreme settler movement. People often hear the word settler in the West, don't quite know what it means. I mean, the short way to describe it is these are people, not all, but many, who are genocidal. If you go to somewhere like Hebron, a very infamous, sort of well-known Palestinian town, and there's about 1,000 Jews, if you go there today, not 50 years ago, today, they are openly calling for the extermination of Palestinians and Arabs, openly, and they're given 110% Israeli government military support. That is the ideology that started off as a fringe movement that is now profoundly mainstream. And I don't know now, in 2023, you can't reverse that. You can't go back to what it was 50, 60 years ago. That is now at the heart, I would argue, the cancer at the heart of Israel.
So it raises questions about what, if any, peace process is doable or viable. And this is sort of my business, so I should sort of know something about it, although I find it really hard because of the picture that you paint to imagine what a viable peace process would look like, even a dialogue at this point. I mean, about 3 or 4 months before this violence, there was an attempt by the Americans to convene the Palestinians and others, I think in Aqaba in Jordan. It was a failure, complete failure.
Shocked to hear that.
Yeah,
Just
I mean,
shocked.
yeah, so the Americans will say, oh, it's not that we haven't tried.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that they knew that it wouldn't work. So, you know, there's been absolutely, and the Palestinian Authority mandated to do this. They refused to hold an election because in any election, Hamas would probably win. And, you know, they're scared in a way of actually going to the table because they know they don't really represent anymore. It's Hamas who represents the Palestinians physically. I mean, despite what the propaganda says, I mean, the fact is the only people fighting for their rights at the moment is Hamas. PA has done nothing. And so it's very hard to imagine what a peace process would look like. And yet, I think we will get to that point once this, you know, awful period passes. We had a European effort, we had an American effort before that, we had the rest of the world sort of chiming in, but nothing has worked. And I think that what we're going to end up with is having to knock it down to its basics again and having to deal with Hamas and Iran. Iran, by the way, I think is the big winner in all this at this point. You know, they wanted Hamas to be the negotiating partner of the Israelis. They always want their proxies to be in front. They've achieved it in Yemen with the Houthis. They've got Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're likely to, if there's any fighting along the border, Iran will move in even more sharply. And so I think what will eventually have to happen is that any process will have to be involving the United States, the Arab world, and Tehran. With no Tehran, no process. And this, of course, is Israel's worst nightmare. I happen to believe that the reason why Israel has demonized Iran so badly over the last 20 years is because they were worried that a peace process might succeed, and they wanted some antidote to a peace process, which, because of the Americans' fear of Iran, was an effective one. But now Iran's going to come front and center again.
So if we were going to have the Michael Vatikiotis peace process, if you were sitting down with Netanyahu now, what would you say? I
would get the Chinese, who have leverage over the Iranians, to do a de-escalation deal between Israel and Iran, and then you'd have to bring Iran to the table with the other Arabs and the Palestinians. Hamas, of course, you know, speaks answers to Iran. So does Hezbollah. They have to be in the room.
What would you say?
I wouldn't be quite so polite. I think that, to me, the only way or the likely way this will end or evolve, I'm not talking about today and tomorrow, is very much similar to how apartheid South Africa ended in 1994. That for decades and decades and decades, there was essentially global acceptance. I'm not talking about people, I'm saying governments widely accepted apartheid South Africa, including Israel. There's a big section in my book actually about that, because that relationship between apartheid South Africa and Israel to me is central to understanding Israel today. There was an ideological alignment between both those states. And the reason I mention that is eventually there were boycotts, there were sanctions, there was divestment against apartheid South Africa until, of course, Mandela was freed. 1994 apartheid ended officially. But it's important to remember, right till the end, the only country that was still friends with them was Israel. Right till the end. And the reason I get South Africa as a so-called model, not because what's happening now is utopia, there are profound problems in South Africa today. There is apartheid existing now, economic apartheid, to be sure. The reason I give that as an example, I do not see a serious shift in Israel-Palestine until there is massive international pressure on Israel. And that might feel very far away today. But I think the longer that Gaza is leveled and attacked and bombed and consumed by war, it's going to be, in inverted commas, easier to build that movement, which already exists. There is a boycott, divestment, sanction movement. I would argue that trying to imagine, this is not by any means to sideline any so-called official negotiations, which have to happen at some point as well. But alongside that, there needs to be massive economic pressure on Israel. Israeli Jews won't suddenly change, wake up one morning and say, this apartheid's pretty awful down the road. No, they need to feel economic pain. That's the only way white South Africans realise that their country was no longer acceptable.
I mean, the only dissent really that I've heard from mainstream Western country or key Western countries has been there's been dissent within the State Department in the US. So can you explain what that dissent is about?
Well, I think it's wider than that. As I said earlier, I think I know from friends that I have in European foreign ministries that I work with that there's very much a growing divide now. I mean, I think the time that you think, the time for massive pressure on Israel may be closer than you think. Because I think this could be, if one looks at it a little bit optimistically, a bit of a breaking point. Because my earlier point as well about European values and civilization, I think many people are sort of saying, well, wait a minute, we do have to draw the line here, because otherwise, who are we? You know, what kind of people are we that we would allow this to happen? And what else can we achieve in the rest of the world if we don't draw the line here? I mean, how can we say that the Russians are evil if we're supporting this kind of evil? And so I think there's a growing realization in particularly sort of younger ranks of the State Department, European foreign ministries, the EU, well, actually, this could be a turning point for us. Now, the problem is the perpetual atonement for the Holocaust is a very powerful, emotive, and now I think politically mobilized, weaponized, the money that's now being spent to influence European establishments, is extraordinary. And so these two forces, I think, are colliding.
One of the things I talk about in the book, which ties into this, is how a lot of people aren't aware of this. In the last years, and this is a loose coalition of sorts, that Israel is building a loose coalition of right-wing and far-right groups and parties around the world. So, for example, it's not uncommon to go to far-right rallies, which I go to for work, not for pleasure, just to be clear.
For you.
And you may see Israeli flags. Now, these are often neo-Nazi groups. So on the face, you might think, hang on a minute, how the hell would neo-Nazis love Israel? How the hell would the alt-right in America admire Israel? And this is the alignment that people need to understand, is that many, many groups around the world, on the right and the far right, often not all supported by Israel, but sometimes, see an ideological alignment with a ethno-nationalist far-right Jewish state. They want to create themselves, say, a Christian ethno-nationalist state, or India, for example, a big section in the book, talks about Modi's vision is a far-right Hindu fundamentalist state. And India is doing its own thing for its own reason, not because of Israel, but Israel is providing huge amounts of inspiration. That's based on comments, documents, details, not just my guess, it's reality. And I say that because, although I agree with Michael, this may be some turning point, the fact is, in many parts around the world, the right and the far right are in the ascendancy.
Not to mention the Christians. So I spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, and when I was researching the book, but also because, it's the city of my father's birth, and my family was in and around Jerusalem for most of that century, that whole century, mid-19th century to mid-20th century. And I started to look at the Christian quarter. In fact, I got an interview with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, and I started to look into the land grab that's going on at the moment. So one part of this jigsaw, in addition to the West Bank, has been the far right's determination to make Jerusalem a completely Jewish city. Jerusalem, which is the half of Christianity, half of Islam, the third most important site in Islam, and Judaism, they want to completely eradicate all that. They want to take over the Dome of the Rock, which is built on the foundations of the Second Temple, and they also want to eradicate the Christian quarter. And they're doing this using smart New York lawyers who go and bribe the church officials and get hold of the leases of the land. And this has happened very publicly. And then when you go to the United States and you say to them, well, but wait a minute, this is the Christian quarter that's being eradicated. But the Christian evangelicals think this is perfectly fine, because the Jews are a chosen people, and Israel has to be completely Jewish so that when the rapture happens...
It's coming.
And it's coming.
It is coming.
It is coming.
Soon.
And
we can only hope.
And God help us, because Mike Pompeo may well be the next Secretary of Defense, and he believes in the rapture, which means that there is no resistance to this at all on the part of the Christians, let alone the Jewish community. And so it's Christians and Jews versus Muslims, basically.
Let me give some hope, because I feel like people might go, oh my God, this is so damn grim.
Can you save that for the last words?
Well, I just want to mention this briefly, because I think this is a really important shift because of all the things that we're talking about. What's happened in the last 10 years is there is a profound shift going on in global Jewish communities.
Yeah.
This is real. What I mean by that is, for decades and decades, there was always Jewish dissent about Israel-Palestine, to be sure. But in general, the Jewish establishment community's view was Israel right or wrong. What's happened in the last 10 years, it's most evident in the US, but Europe as well, Australia to an extent, is generally along generational lines. I call it there's an insurgency within the Jewish community. And what that means is that so many, particularly younger Jews, will no longer tolerate being told by their rabbi, father, mother, grandparent, we must support Israel. Just a few days ago in Congress, there were 500 Jews occupying Congress, not in a violent way, peaceful way, including rabbis, calling for a ceasefire. It's one example. Now, I'm not suggesting it's the majority of the Jewish community in America. It's not. But it's a growing, vocal, powerful minority. And I say that because the only way Israel can survive in the long term, I would argue, yes, evangelical Christian support is vital, but the only way it's survived for 75 years is massive Jewish diaspora backing. That is breaking down.
I do wonder, though, I mean, just circling back to something I asked earlier, if Hamas had undermined its own cause by the viciousness of the October 7 attack and by, alienating liberal Israelis and liberal Jews around the world.
Undeniably. I think you'd be a fool to suggest that the brutal Hamas attack may not have a negative effect in some areas of Palestinian solidarity. I'm not saying all peoples, and including in the Jewish community, where I know there's lots of agonized conversation going on internally. I'm talking about the US and the UK and elsewhere to sort of say, this is... We support Palestine and Palestine rights and Palestinian self-determination, but the level of brutality against us as Jews was so extreme that I think for some, I'm not saying for me, but for some, it is definitely causing some Jews, not in some ways unsurprisingly, to really question where we go forward. I think that's true, but I do think the longer Israel is bombarding Gaza, and again, let's be clear, this didn't start 2 weeks ago. The West Bank's been on fire for years. Every single day now. Every day there are multiple Palestinian civilians being killed. Every day. This is the reality in Palestine. It didn't happen 2 weeks ago. It's been going on for years. And that is the reality that Palestinians face.
And I think it is shifting, as Antony... I mean, just last week, or earlier this week, when when Biden made his speech, I mean, it was very much in one direction, but they've had to row that back. I mean, 500 children, and then the hospital attack. I mean, I think it's now, going back to my earlier point about the division within government, I mean, we've gone from the State Department saying that they can't use the word, de-escalation or ceasefire, to the White House rowing back its statements so that they're now including a two-state solution in the sort of White House memes, because I think they realise this is unsustainable. It's, you know, that...
Two-state is dead. I mean,
I know, but
2 states, please.
But-
It's done.
But never mind. My point is that they're rowing back
Yes.
from the unconditional to something that requires something else.
Well, if a two-state's dead, I mean, is a one-state even possible? I mean,
Well, can I
How's it
answer that?
gonna
Because
look?
I was actually met some people 2018, 2019 who were one-staters. These are Arabs living in Israel who felt, you know, there might be a chance to live in a pluralistic democracy. This seems like an eon ago, but actually in that election they did quite well. I mean, the one-staters did quite well. They're Arab parties who got elected, and they have a significant number of MPs. I forget the number, and that's when the right wing pounced, because I think that was a threat to them as well.
Is one state possible? Well, today and tomorrow, probably not. But again, Israel is facing an existential question. There's only two options here. There's indefinite occupation and apartheid, which is what we're in now, or some kind of resolution towards a solution. So I would argue one state. I think one state is the only viable long-term solution. But the alternative is apartheid. That's what it is now. So when Israel says, oh, how can we talk to Palestinians? You know, they're terrorists, or Hamas are killing our citizens. Sure, that's horrific what happened. But ultimately and eventually, I would argue that the US, in fact, should not be involved in any negotiations. Cut them, I mean, that won't happen. Cut them out. The idea that the US has any credibility, they have zero credibility. Credibility with whom? With Palestinians? No.
The president was disinvited from a summit that he set up in Jordan.
I mean, Biden goes to Israel and kind of is like some senile old man. He doesn't know what he's talking about on Palestine. It is so embarrassing. This is US leadership. He sort of said a few days ago, the world needs more American leadership. No, the world needs no American leadership. This is not the solution.
Poor sponsors. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, our dear sponsors of the Ubud Writers Festival. God bless America. Yeah, okay.
Michael, at the beginning of the year, you tweeted some predictions for the year.
Oh God, you saw that, did you? Yeah.
Oh, I did. One of them was that there would be a complete annexation of the occupied territories.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very much of Antony's view that this has just been building up, and you know, it's far worse than people realise. And one of my predictions at the beginning of the year was that there would be more and more of this leading to, you know, but the third part of that prediction is also very important, which is a breakdown of the rules-based order. And I think, you know, we really do have to pay attention to this, because otherwise none of us have any leverage at all anymore. You know, and Israel is the most difficult. I mean, as an organization, we've never dealt with the state of Israel, because, you know, we've always felt that there's no one that can speak to the state of Israel other than, you know, previously the United States, but not even that. And it's an extremely difficult government to deal with. And they have devious ways of making sure that, you know, whatever conversations you're having. At the very early stage of my career as a private diplomat, tried to organize a dialogue between Hamas and the Europeans here in Indonesia. The Indonesians were all for it. The Europeans were all for it. The Israelis got hold of it, called the Americans called the Indonesian president, said that's not going to happen. So, you know, I mean, that was 15 years ago.
That's that American leadership we love and admire so much, isn't it?
So I think we really have to pay attention to that third part of this, which involves all of us, which is what values do we ascribe to our foreign policies, to our government aid policies, and can we sustain them if we ourselves don't uphold the rule of law?
I'm so intrigued, just quickly, by the title of private diplomat. I've been trying to nut that out for a while. Who hires you?
Well, in a way, there's more and more demand because the multilateral system is broken, and governments, as we see, have no agency anymore. And increasingly, people turn to private organizations to facilitate things that governments are either not willing to do, or can't do, won't do in many cases, and also to try and fill in the gaps in a system that is completely broken, with no one really thinking about how to rebuild it. And so what do? You hire a temp, temporary help.
Have you put your hand up yet?
Well, we do. That's what we do. I mean, more and more of our work is interstate because of that, because it's the interstate relations that are broken.
Inter or intra?
Inter.
But you've done...
Right. Can I say one thing? Sorry, just in addition to what Michael said, there is this obsession in much of the West about the so-called rules-based international order. It does not exist.
It does not exist. It's
now,
broken.
when I say that, as in, and Michael mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously a hideous violation of all rights, but have we forgotten a multitude of other crimes? The American invasion of Iraq, the American invasion of Libya, which was illegitimate. I mean, there are so many examples where there is no accountability for anyone who commits torture, kills civilians. I'm talking about American officials, Israeli officials. By all means, let's arrest and take on African dictators. I'm not opposed to that. But at the same time, it's remarkable how within about 10 minutes of Putin invading Ukraine, he was charged by the ICC. By all means, charge Putin, a thug. But it's interesting how there's no desire or interest in potentially prosecuting George W. Bush or Barack Obama or any US leader since World War II, all of whom, by definition, are war criminals. By definition. None of that.
And is Netanyahu a war criminal?
Of course he is. And I say that because when we talk about the rules-based international order, so-called, which my government and many other governments preach, most of the world laughs. They look at you and they say, sorry, how about Iraq? How about Afghanistan? How about Palestine? They laugh at you.
So the UN is in a panic at the moment because all the resolutions that were passed against Russia in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, which actually were often razor-thin majorities, because this double standard is already taken hold in much of the global south. And people hate to use that term because they're afraid of the other. There is an other out there. There are all these countries that now look at the behavior of the United States and Europe and say, I'm sorry, you're just simply, it's a double standard. And now, whatever support they had at the UN, there's a very interesting story that happened beginning of this year, the anniversary of the invasion, when the United States sponsored a resolution at a General Assembly to condemn the Russians for the invasion on the anniversary. The UAE had a resolution at the Security Council, because they're on the Security Council, condemning the situation in the settlements, in the West Bank. The Americans pleaded with them, please remove that resolution. And they said, why? Said, because if you have that resolution at the same time we're doing this condemnation of Ukraine, it's just not going to pass. And you know what? The UAE said, what's it worth? What's it worth?
Well, they're a nice client state, so they had to take... Yeah,
so they did remove it in return for not putting sanctions on the UAE for what the Russians are doing in Dubai. So it was a good deal for the UAE. But that shows how razor-thin that sort of polarity of the sort of Western world is at the UN. And this is going to make it far worse.
Mm.
So just to finish up, I'd just like to hear from both of you about what your best prediction is on how this is going to play out in the short term.
You mean in Gaza?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, nowhere good. I think Israel will send ground troops in shortly, today, tomorrow, next week. We don't know when. I fear many of the hostages that Hamas has. We don't know the exact figure. Every day I read the numbers seem to change, but it appears to be over 200, many of whom are civilians. I fear many of them will die. My fear is that the Israeli establishment is not particularly concerned by that. Some of them have actually said that. It's a price worth giving up. I think there's also, it's worth saying, profound anger within Israel towards Netanyahu.
Yes.
A lot of polls say that he should resign tomorrow. He won't, but there is massive, profound anger towards him because he is blamed correctly for the unbelievable disaster on October 7. Israel will go into Gaza on ground troops. I fear it's going to be an ugly guerrilla war. I think it's conceivable that Hamas can be, inverted commas, overthrown militarily, its architecture destroyed. Of course, huge amounts of civilians killed. I think Israel will inevitably begin a global assassination campaign against Hamas leadership because most Hamas leadership don't live in Gaza. They live around the Arab and Muslim world. So all those leaders of Hamas looking over their shoulder right now because I think they will not have a long life. Israel has done this in the past with Palestinian leaders. So it's going to get ugly. The fear that's finally is, of course, that you start bringing Hezbollah in the north. I hope to hell that does not happen because if it does, the US will be involved in a major way, and that is
And
potentially
Iran. And Iran.
then it's potentially World War III.
So I think, just to add, I mean, maybe slightly different, what may happen when Israel goes into into Gaza, is Hamas may have calculated if they can kill 1,500 IDF troops, that's victory for them. It's an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
And, they may be decimated, but they will kill as many IDF as possible. And that's going to have political ramifications in Israel as well. And that's where their victory lies. Because Netanyahu is finished. He should be in jail, should have been in jail a long time ago. He will be put in jail, hopefully next to Palestinians. And, because, he really is to blame for this. But that will not, and it's a question to you, I mean, will that address the far right? Will a more sensible Israeli government come along and re-establish a sense of balance? Or do you
I
think
wish
it's too
I
late?
believed that, because one of the things that I think is worth saying, so many people here will have seen these huge amounts of Israeli Jewish protesters this year protesting against Netanyahu before the current situation. And the Western media's frame that as they're saving Israeli democracy. It's bollocks. That's not what they're saving. They're claiming that they want to maintain Jewish democracy. And there's a reason why no Palestinians are protesting. They're not interested in Jewish democracy. It doesn't benefit them. It benefits Jews who are living a Jewish supremacist lifestyle, A. And B, we are sold this idea from this protest movement that the Israeli Supreme Court is the last check on democracy. The Supreme Court in Israel has spent 50 years being a rubber stamp for the occupation. And Palestinians know that.
Or we, unfortunately, may go back to the status quo ante where the Palestinians are ignored. There's a sort of general stability again, and everyone just ignores the problem.
Well, on that note, I trust you'll all keep your eyes on the news, and I thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Anthony,
Thank
I know
you.
in particular for you, it's been a huge few weeks.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to Michael too, and I urge you to please read their books. They're both brilliant books, and peace be with you all.
Thanks, Kirsti.
Thank you, Kirsti.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.